Good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody on the call. My name is Dan Lawhorn, and I'm joined by Miguel Caballero. We're on the field engineering team here at Vercel. We are very excited about Next.js 16 migrations and uh, brought together this little webinar today to kind of talk about some of the really cool new features that exist in Next 16, some of the things that are necessary for migrating from previous versions. And we're going to do a pretty deep dive on a particular feature in Next 16 that we are especially excited about here at Vercel. So, kind of on the agenda, we have those new features, some breaking changes. We're going to go into a brief history of rendering just to kind of show, where we think a lot of you guys on the call might be at and how we think that gets us into the future. I want to show just kind of a current example of some e-commerce, some really simple e-commerce code. Not going to get too deep on an example, but enough that we think people should be pretty familiar with it. And then we're going to kind of talk about that big feature, cache components, and how we can refactor into that. And then we have a little bit of a discussion of what you can do from there. And then with time left over, we'd love to do a little bit of Q&A. We'll have support for questions, and Miguel will be kind of in the questions section, and he might be popping in and out to alert me to some of those. So, yeah, let's get going. Um, if you go to the Next.js blog, you'll see the big post that was posted in late October at Next.js Conf for the release of Next 16. It is a really beefy blog post, and we didn't want to just go through line by line of that post because we would have been here well more than an hour. It is a huge release, a lot of years in the making. And if you want to get more information than what we present in this call, there's plenty more to be read there. So nextjs.org/blog is going to be the place to go for that. Um, we wanted to pick just a couple of the specific new features to really highlight. The first is the Next.js DevTools MCP. If you are doing, local agent work, your Claude codes, your cursors of the world, you can actually enable an AI agent to diagnose issues, explain behavior, and suggest fixes directly within your development workflow. The documentation for that is available here on the Next.js docs. It shows you how to configure that in your code editor or IDE of choice. And it just shows you all of the things that the MCP is going to be capable of. We do know that, historically, some of the LLMs have had a little bit of a tougher time generating great Next.js code. This is really going to be a huge boon to anybody who's doing that kind of agent-aided development. So feel free to try it out today. That is already in release, and we would love feedback that people are getting from that. Um, Another really great feature is React compiler support. React compiler automatically memoizes components, so it reduces unnecessary re-renders with zero manual code changes. Basically, some of that kind of tricky, why is this thing getting rendered in React? Some of the stuff that we don't necessarily always go into the innards on. React compiler support in Next.js is able to take care of a lot of that for us. The only thing worth calling out for that is that it does use Babel to do that, so it might add a little bit of time to your compilation. But once again, over on the Next.js docs, you can get deeper with this, including how you can do an incremental implementation of React compiler. There's also improved logging, which we'll show a little bit as we're doing the code demo, but you just get a little bit more insight in the logs of what's happening, how long it's taking, and what each amount of time is doing uh, when you're both doing next dev and next build. So this is really great insights and also helps back with that MCP server because the MCP server is reading the logs and it can get a little bit more insight into what's going on as you're developing your app. So those are the features that we really wanted to highlight. There are a whole bunch more on the site, including the adapters API, makes it even easier to build new features in Next.js in ecosystems outside of Vercel. Um, as far as breaking changes go, the biggest one, the one that will probably affect the most people, is middleware.ts has been renamed to proxy.ts in the app, and you will export a proxy value instead of a middleware value. The reason for this choice was that, you know, it was acting as a middleware, but it didn't act the exact same as the middleware you may have come to expect from using something like Express. And we wanted to make it kind of clear that it's a slightly different thing. It's acting like a proxy layer. Things go through, you can read the request and response, but it's a layer. So any kind of logic that you do there can kind of add milliseconds or however long to the request. And we just want people to know that this is a place, generally you want a light touch. So that renaming is essential if you're upgrading to Next 16 and have middleware. You'll just do a simple rename there. Another great feature, TurboPack is on by default. TurboPack is the fast compile engine built specifically for Next.js. Brings 2 to 5 times faster production and up to 10 times faster fast refresh when doing local dev. It's really great. Passes the entire Next.js test suite. But if you are specifically using features of Webpack or want to continue to use Webpack, you can. You'll just pass a Webpack flag to your dev and build commands. So that is just kind of a switch. In Next 15, it was a TurboPack flag, and now you just switch it over to be a Webpack flag. Another big one, async page props. If you were using Next 15, the page props supported both synchronous and asynchronous actions. Going forward in Next 16, it is just going to be asynchronous. So you'll want to await params or await search params if you're using any of those values in an app router page component. Um, and there are also new minimum requirements. We're up to Node 20.9, TypeScript 5.1, and a new minimum browser requirement for all the features that Next.js is bringing along. There are a few more breaking changes in once again in the blog post for the Next 16 announcement and in the docs. It goes deeper with them. One of the big ones is AMP support is removed. If you are still using Google's AMP format, that is no longer supported in Next 16. Um, for all of these, we have the Next.js code mod. So if you want to run that command there on the screen or read the docs on the code mod, it can help you with this migration. Same with the MCP server that we rolled out. Um, so yeah, that's kind of some of the big stuff that is mentioned or was part of the Next 16 release. But there's a huge feature that I really want to get into, and I think is really a lot of the meat of why people are wanting to upgrade to Next 16, and that is around rendering strategies and caching strategies. But before we can kind of talk about that, I think we want to talk about just a brief history of how we got to this point. The first Next 1.0 was released in October of 2016. So we're sitting at close to a decade of the modern era of composability development. And kind of in each epoch, within that decade, we've had some different strategies that have had trade-offs, pros and cons, but always perpetually trying to move us forward in what our Next.js apps are capable of. The first rendering strategy was get initial props. And this was the original way to fetch data for server-side rendering, but it's kind of an all or nothing proposition on your page. And then it only ran client-side on client-side navigation. So it was kind of an incomplete kind of spec for doing server-side rendering in a site. And it didn't in and of itself have kind of cache heuristics. You could add some cache headers here and there, but it's a little complex to use and didn't necessarily scale all the way to your production use case. So from get initial props, we released get static props and get server-side props. Those were kind of the two really big breakthroughs in the Next.js pages router. It gave you the ability to decide if a page was going to be statically rendered or fully server rendered. If you're making it static rendered, you had a select use case of the request object. You didn't have full control over the response object, but you could create kind of static pages, and it was really great. You know, a lot of people still actually haven't made the migration to App Router because they love the feeling that they get from get static props and get server-side props. Get server-side props is an especially common pattern that people use that and then use a CDN to the caching. So they have the full request and response object and then set some sort of cache header on the response. It lets them, see the query parameters, see cookies, do all these kind of things that you couldn't get in the static page. Um, so those were really the two popular rendering strategies, but they were part of Pages router. And that word I think is really important here in this conversation, which is pages. They kind of thought of the data that exists on a page as one big top level request. That the page was everything that was on the page. And with this story of us, constantly evolving our app, it's also because we are constantly evolving our appetites for what our app should be capable of. And a big part of that is sometimes a page for me and a page for Miguel and a page for you guys out there in the chat could possibly be a pretty different experience. We might all go to the same URL, but because those cookies or query parameters or some sort of A/B experiment, we might be wanting to get served up something different. And not necessarily universally something different, possibly something different below the fold, possibly something different, just a little button here or a little button there. But we had to kind of have this all or nothing mentality going into it. It had to happen at the top level because in Pages Router, that is your request. So we can kind of talk about the trade-offs that we would make in this kind of model, but we'll actually get to that as soon as we get through App Router. So App Router was the first evolution that saw us moving from this idea that a website is a series of pages to your website is an application, and that an application isn't the data doesn't necessarily always live at the page level. So we enabled more complex rendering by using React Server components. This let us do things like separate layouts from pages. This let us have data in components. It let us kind of fetch anywhere we wanted to, and it gave us a lot of control over the experience. What it didn't give us was total control over the request object. And it still didn't necessarily solve for the fact that if we were doing all of this kind of dynamic stuff, we could have some caches, but we couldn't have dynamic stuff and cache stuff kind of living together really effectively. So it still wasn't necessarily getting us all the way to the complexity that we were feeling in our own apps. So in 2023, with the announcement of Next 14, there was the announcement of experimental partial pre-rendering. And this is really the first step in getting us to cache components today, because that's the idea that static and dynamic can be available on the same page, that we could render out a static shell and then fill that with dynamic data and give us the advantage of that static response, that instantaneous shell, that 100 page speed insight response, but then stream in the data that might be distinct, that we might need to know about the page first to then load this kind of data, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a blocking experience for us to load the page. Partial pre-rendering, a lot was learned with that flag, but it was only ever released on Canary releases of Next.js. So a lot of companies were just simply never able to use partial pre-rendering unless you were willing to ship a Canary feature out into production, which you had to be kind of crazy or kind of brave or kind of stupid, some combination of the three to be willing to do that. Um, and so that gets us to a current example. That's really kind of the state of the art when it comes to those rendering strategies. But I'm going to take a pause here. Miguel, have we had any questions that have popped up in the chat that we might want to talk through before we get deep diving into the code?
There's been a few questions that have come through. Nothing too much to really need too much more discussion. One of the clarifications that I do want to make about one of the hard requirements about Next 16 is that you will need to be on React 19. That is one thing that we did not bring up, but that was, I think, the only major thing that I also wanted to re-hit on. We do have a question in the Q&A about the idea of cache components that I think will be answered or at least talked through a little bit more soon. So I'm going to hold off on answering that one, but we'll bring that up, I think, in a little bit.
Awesome. Thanks.
And then
Yeah,
let's
so
see. You're good.
we are requiring React 19 with Next 16 as well. That does let you take advantage of React 19.2 and some of the features, including the activity component, use effect event, a lot of really great features that are getting into React are ready to go day one, available on Next 16. So yeah, we have a current example. And for this, we wanted to really drill down on what was essential for the e-commerce experience for a lot of people. And a lot of that is rendering and then managing the data on your rendered page. So we wanted to make sure that we had an example that we could really deeply walk through in the course of this webinar. So we're not going to get, too much into the complexity because as we've learned on the field engineering team of Vercel, a lot of people, do slightly different things with their e-commerce website. And that's stuff that you really want to engage on a one-on-one basis. But we wanted this kind of universal experience. And we used e-commerce as a lens because It is my particular passion. I was an e-commerce developer before I joined Vercel. I've, lived and breathed this stuff. It's as familiar to me as my child's face. But when it comes to your Next.js application, a product is a post, is a profile, is a dashboard. It is data. So hopefully, if you live in kind of the editorial space, or if you live in a kind of platform space, the content that we're seeing, even though it's product data, is going to be pretty familiar to, your own application and how cache components is going to be useful. So we have this little sample website here. It is designed based on my favorite webinar design principle, which is don't have anything that has people asking you to zoom in to view it. So we have these kind of, just big chunky text, big chunky products. And when I refresh the page, you'll see that we had that little flash of unstyled content. So what was going on there? And what was going on there was that was a client-side render of this particular data. Because it was product data and it didn't belong to this homepage, we're actually fetching that from an API route. Now, this isn't a pattern that a lot of people would do above the fold. Their design team would be like, we can't have, that that kind of flash of unstyled content happening. You might get cumulative layout shift as a ding from your page speed insights with that. But we wanted to show that this is an example that people have and that can be refactored over. So that actually kind of goes into back in our deck, stopgap rendering solutions. These are the solutions that we reach for when we realize that we have a component that we still can't render on the server because it would either be too degraded of a browsing experience or we just can't pull it off based on how our data works. So client-side rendering is going to be a very common pattern for that. You have something, you have a loading state, you call to some API infrastructure that you expose, possibly running it through a proxy route so you could attach cookies so you don't have to expose those to the client. The data comes back and then you render the component out. Based on how Next.js works with client side, it could be very fast. It could be a barely noticeable flicker, but it has to hydrate and then do that event. So you will get some kind of flicker when using client side rendering. So one of the other strategies that we'd have to mitigate that would be what we call sequential promises. You might have a page that has some data, and then you need that data for the next call. So you kind of waterfall, you wait the first one, and then you wait the next one, and then you wait the next one. And then at the end, once you have all that information, we could cache that. So generally speaking, you would serve up the cache to people, and only, a handful of people are really going to get, that kind of brutalized, degraded experience. But somebody will, and it's generally unpleasant. There's also the risk that as you're making, these waterfalls of calls that, an error could happen and suddenly the whole thing, you throw an error, you throw a 404, you have to really decide what you want to do with the failure in this situation. It becomes a little bit more perilous. Another thing that we can do is complex page queries. We could kind of come up with these elaborate graph systems to bind our data together to let us have one page that can pull page content from here, that can pull data from here, and the data for the product pulls data from there. Um, but that is generally, pretty complex work. And it becomes work that can become kind of blocking on future renders, that you now have a full backend story that as that backend changes, some of your other rendered pages might change. So that you might have to update how those other pages rendered based on API updates to make sure things are consistent. If you find yourself in Next 15 land and are continue, or even Next 14 or Next 13 and want to use ISR, incremental static regeneration, and have these, we do have a really great guide that was written by our field engineering team about how to build really great graph queries using an example of Sanity CMS. So this is a pattern that is really common and a lot of people have found a lot of success with it. But one of the challenges that we'll get into when it comes to how you manage your site is with this still being that top level request, we don't know what's going into that graph call. We only know as much as what we know at the time that we're making the call. And so the more complex that is, the more data we're presenting there. We're having more and more data that we just don't really have granular control over. So that leads people oftentimes back to using that client-side render because the request needs to be independent of the entire page and it needs to go back and forth regularly and it needs to be updated really frequently, whereas a page might not need to. So another part of our common rendering solutions is make it the CDN's problem. We slap a CDN in front of our site. It handles the caching for us. We just give it the data and we assume that it's going to continue to be really fast because it's going to blow it out to our points of presence. You know, no, no, no huge problem with this. It's very common for people. On today of all days, it is kind of a CDN news day. But that's a thing that can happen in a lot of different infrastructures. And you have a lot of different options for CDNs and a lot of different features available to that. But the challenge with a lot of the CDN in front approach is that your CDN lives one place and your application lives another. They don't really have connective tissue as except for that a request is moving to and fro. So you have to kind of build up infrastructure yourself to build a relationship between your application and your CDN. The other common pattern that we encounter with people is no caching at all. They just have highly available data. It's fast. It is designed to be, requested a gajillion times. It's going to hold up. Frankly, I got a little vertigo putting this slide on a deck the week before Black Friday, Cyber Monday, hoping that, as you're seeing that traffic wave spike, that your resources are not going to rate limit you, that they're all going to hold up. But there are plenty of people who don't do conventional caching in their application at all. And they have the resources that can take care of that. Within all of those rendering strategies, though, we do have manageability trade-offs. So even if we get to a place where we're really happy with the speed and performance of our website, how maintainable is the information on our website when we're caching it? To kind of show an example of that in our app, let's go to one of these PDPs. I'm just going to go to this t-shirt here, and you can see that it's $60 here. I click through. Once again, we have that client-side render of our related products. I refresh, and this page is statically rendered. It's really fast, but we still see that client-side flicker. And if I were to go to a PLP, a listing page, and I would see that it is also $60 here. But this page also loading really fast. We're remembering our scroll position. I click through, everything looks fine. I'm going to click this button here to simulate that I'm resetting the price of that product. You can see that the product has now been updated to $140. It's very in demand, or it was on sale and it's no longer on sale. This could also, be simulating, is it in stock or is it out of stock? Now I refresh and I'm still getting that statically rendered PDP. Everything is really good here on that experience. But if I go back to the tease page, it's still showing me that this particular product was $60. Right now, there's not a lot that you can do in your Next.js application about this problem. So what are the kind of solutions that we would reach for managing information in this situation? Well, we could inefficiently revalidate. That is really the most frequent solution that people come up with, which is that on pages where the data needs to be up to date, if they weren't choosing a no caching solution, or if they weren't choosing like a highly available data solution for that particular information, they'd just be revalidating this page over and over again, way faster than is probably necessary, and not really an event-driven model, so much as just every couple of minutes, we'll just make sure that this data is in sync. And if it's out of sync for a minute, well, when they add to cart and hit that backstop, they should still be okay. And so that is both, kind of frustrating based on, just that kind of guessing game experience, but also that is using resources. That is using, duration of your server. That is recaching. So it's kind of creating all these transactions in your cache system. It's not the best way to work. Because we have that simplistic caching. Caches only know what they know at the time of their invocation. So if I was on that product page, I would know the name of the product and I could fetch the data based on that. But once I get the product, I can't do any caching based on the fact that it is a t-shirt. I can't do any caching based on the fact that it is available in medium and small and purple. Um, that is the kind of information that exists inside the thing once it's already cached. And with that simplistic caching, a lot of it was based purely around HTTP fetching. And generally speaking, at the beginning, it was based around GET requests. It eventually got expanded to POST requests. And we released the unstable cache function to let you wrap things that weren't fetches to create caches, but it always had that same constraint. It didn't know about the data inside of the thing in order to determine the cache. This leads to a really degraded developer experience because any of those kind of rendering solutions that you're reaching for, a lot of them can make it a little bit more difficult to develop, especially if you're using something like a third-party CDN and you are kind of opting out of the caching inside of your own application. Your application is no longer telling the complete story of what your application is trying to do. So your local dev might either take forever or you have to kind of simulate that there's a CDN in front of it. Then when you have preview deployments at places like Vercel and other managed infrastructure sites, you have to make sure that that CDN is going to be configured in front of every branch, or you only have a few select branches that are acting as the source of truth for UAT and QA. Uh, that's not the experience we want people to have. We want everybody to be able to take the application and the application to tell the story of its caching and of the infrastructure it needs. At Vercel, we call this framework defined infrastructure, and it's a principle that guides the Next team, the Svelte team, the Nuxt team, and really just about everything that we do and everything that we build. We want your application to be portable and we want it to be powerful. So all of this together leads to this idea of what Fred Brooks, while writing No Silver Bullet, called inessential complexity. The code might be opaque. There might be procurement sprawl. There might be complicated process. You might have more people involved in this loop than just the application and the merchandisers or the people creating the data. There's going to be more upkeep because there's just a lot of things happening and a lot of different places to touch. There's going to be more usage because you're revalidating really quickly, and there's just more cognitive load. You need to document more things. You don't necessarily know why one page behaves completely differently than another, and your application can't necessarily tell you all of why it's happening that way without things like additional docs. So that gets us to the place of kind of the modern state of things. We've been able to accomplish so much. We've been able to make really, really great applications, but they don't get us all the way there. They don't meet the completeness of our appetites, which is to say nothing of stories of personalization and experimentation and just general relevance to your website. So that leads us to cache components, what we think is really the next major era in rendering strategies for composable websites. And before we do a deep dive into that, I want to once again take a pause. And Miguel, did we get any kind of questions during that segment? Because I know that was a lot of different concepts and a lot of different assumptions about how people are building their app.
So I'm going to bring up the question that we haven't answered yet. There are questions coming in, and I am trying my darnest to type as fast as I can for my words per minute streak here. But one of the questions that came in, it says, I still don't get the property of the next config cache components being true. Says, I know that it forces an app to use suspense every time and remove blocking from pages like asynchronous blocks for data fetching, for user information, etc. When should I not use it? Most of the time, I have highly dynamic apps with Supabase, Drizzle, etc., and it cannot and should not be cached. Should I still use this property? So I think that will be the big one for you to tackle, Mr. Davis.
Yeah, so that is a really great question because there's a lot of dynamic data. Like a lot of our pages, almost everybody's page has something that's dynamic. Even in a statically cached e-commerce site, we probably want something like your shopping cart to always be up to date. That's always going to be something that we need, it's there are probably caching strategies with that, but generally speaking, you want that to be true. If people switch between devices, they obviously want their cart to be up to date. Not a lot of benefit for that being out of date. Just about everybody's website generally has something dynamic going on with it. What we still probably want is performance. Like the shell of the page itself is possibly still something you want served up statically. And you might, say, okay, I can serve up, just kind of like a create React app kind of application. I'll serve up a static page and then it'll do a loader and then I'll run authentication. And if they're unauthenticated, nothing ever loaded beyond the loader and they get kicked to an auth state or we show them a login screen or an error or whatever. Um, but that once again, kind of exposes that client-side architecture, which is a sprawl that you have to create. And it is generally in my own personal experience, may be a little less secure than streaming something in on your page. You don't have to expose any architecture out to the world to be able to have similar functionality to that client-side API call. So cache components is really useful in those situations because you still get the benefit of the fast page load. And you still get the benefit in Next.js. One thing that, some people have struggled with is sometimes that blocking experience can be a less um, luxurious client-side navigation experience from page to page. Cache components allows you to go, page to static page and then stream things in dynamically. So you're going to get the speed of performance, even if you aren't even necessarily caching data, but you want to stream something that's dynamic in. There's still a lot of advantage to using cache components. And as far as that flag you mentioned, that's a really great kind of starter place for us in our refactoring that we'll kind of walk through. So the idea with cache components, just the high level is you don't compromise between static and dynamic. You can have things that are static and you can have things that are dynamic, and you can keep them separated, or you can actually create this story where a thing starts off static and thing starts off dynamic, and that thing that was dynamic becomes part of the static thing. So it's just kind of unblocked from creating that negative experience for the first visitor. Um, so this is both a performance story and a manageability story. Sometimes we want things to be cached, but sometimes we want things to be dynamic because that data needs to be different, it needs to be uncached, it needs to come through. And we can have them living in the same place without caching being a complete top level blocker of our experience of that page. This completes the story of partial pre-rendering. So PPR, as we call it, is part of cache components. So that initial release in Next 14 paved the way, and we're still using a lot of that same code and that same functionality to power cache components. Cache components is kind of an umbrella concept. It also combines last year, if you messed with dynamic IO at all or use cache, which we'll get into, that is part of cache components as well. So it is this kind of all-encompassing idea of how do we get static and dynamic happening simultaneously. It's mostly centered around the use cache directive. So it uses, in conjunction with cache life and cache tag, this determines how our caches are going to behave and how the app is going to experience what it considers a cache and not. Um, Felt like this was also a great place to kind of stop and talk about the directive, the use blank directive. It's a very hot topic. A lot of opinions about should this thing be used and why is it a directive and not a function. Um, the big reason that it exists as a directive is your infrastructure needs this to be statically analyzable. It needs to know that it's hitting something that needs to be cached to then provision resources correctly and provision functionality correctly. So the use string kind of taking a technicality that existed in the JavaScript ecosystem and running with it and expanding it. You'll also see it with use server or use client, or even for the React compiler, there's a use memo directive. You can actually write your own directives. A lot of people have started really experimenting with this, and so it's a feature that existed that really allowed the features to move forward. There are still a lot of discussions about could this, be an annotation? How can I get typing for these things? These are questions that no one is taking for granted, particularly on the next side. But a lot of it is, at the moment, this is just a necessary static indicator for your infrastructure to build cache components correctly. Now, cache life and cache tag, those are functions, as we'll walk into. Those determine how long a cache should live and what kind of information the cache should be tagged with. Those are dynamic values. Those are values that can be conditionally run based on different parameters. You can sometimes cache life a thing based on data that's inside the cache. And if the data isn't there, not cache life it, for instance. So those are functions, and those can still be run as inline functions. But the cache directive in and of itself has to be static. So you have that little string, and it's not everybody's favorite feature in the world, but it is essential for making all of this work. So let's migrate to cache components. Let's look at what we're using with that little simple e-commerce ISR app and see what it would look like to rerun that in cache components. I'm going to slide on over here. And we have cursor here with my super high-vis 2 looking theme here. Um, Miguel, can I get a thumbs up that this is visible enough? I know we didn't want the text to be quite as big as the website, but we still
Yeah, I
want it.
say I'm not giving you a thumbs up, but I'll tell you you're good.
Fair enough. So we have a little monorepo here with a before app and an after app. The before app is running on the latest version of Next 15.5, so before Next 16 came out. It is also worth mentioning that cache components is a flag in feature. It is not necessary for upgrading to Next 16. You opt into this behavior. So if you're using Next 15 and you can upgrade without enabling cache components, worth it for all of the gains that you get in the ecosystem. But what we're about to do here with this refactoring is not a requirement to be using Next 16. So in a lot of ways, it is the easiest major upgrade path that has been around for Next.js in a decently long time. And but all of this is just kind of optional. So we'll go into before, we look at our next config, and there's nothing going on with this one. We don't have any flags enabled. We are just using out of the box app router rendering behavior. And we go to our app and we go to that products page and we look at this is our component for our PDP. You see one thing that we're doing here is we are using ISR by using generate static params. And with generate static params, you return an array of things that you want pre-rendered. For me, I like it kind of rendered on demand, so I return an empty array. Um, then when we go into our page component, we pull out the handle. We then have a function that says, okay, I want to look for the product in my database that has that handle. I want to revalidate it once a month, and I want to tag it with its handle. If the product doesn't exist, I'm going to throw a 404. Otherwise, I'm going to render out that component. And then down here for those related products that fetch in on the client, I'm doing no use effect. I'm fetching my API route. I'm grabbing some data. Then I'm rendering that out. I'm ending the loading state and then iterating through all those products and rendering them out as a component. So these are really kind of the two basic components features we're really going to be focusing on. We're going to be focusing on how does the page get rendered and what can we do about that client side rendering? Can we move that to something that exists in the app? And the first thing to do in your after application is go down to that next config and set that cache components flag to true. You can see that this, while it was in development in Canary, this lived in the experimental object. It now lives as a top level flag along with React compiler. So to get these behaviors, you do need to flag in to use them. Eventually that, once, you guys out in the ecosystem have started adopting cache components, and we've really been able to test it against production workloads and figured out all those edge cases. This will probably switch polarity eventually and become a default rendering strategy. But for now, it is still opt-in. Um, but really, I want to go back to the ISR site because there's going to be one thing when people are doing cache components. Almost everybody is going to stub their toe in exactly the same place. I can't read the chat. Miguel, can you see if anybody's willing to guess what the first thing that's going to trip people up is going to be?
No messages coming in right now.
Do you know what the first thing that's going to mess people up is going to be?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm reading the chat, man. You have me jumping around the place, but I see caching runtime APIs like params. Suspense. I'm seeing query params is an answer I see.
Those are all really great in concepts that we're going to get into. The one that is going to stub the toes the most. Oh, we have a hand raised.
We can do that?
I don't
I don't know how Zoom works.
I don't know
All
what
good.
that hand raiser say. Can we put
Let's
it in
see.
the chat? All right. What's going to trip people up is going to be the timestamp in the footer of your website. So the way cache components works is that things that are dynamic and serverful need to be cached, or they need to be explicitly passed through from the server. And for a long time in your website, say back in the WordPress days, you were just writing copyright 2015, all rights reserved in the footer of your website. People got really tired of getting clowned on by having out-of-date timestamps in their footer, so they started using in JavaScript new date, get full year, all rights reserved. That is unfortunately what we refer to as IO now. That is a server-based value. So you're going to have to do something about that and possibly use it as a cache component. I will also say in my slides that I do have update the data in the footer. Maybe you don't need this at all. Maybe it's legally dubious and it's just a thing that we all kind of copy and paste onto our websites. This is not legal advice, but maybe talk to your legal department if you need the copyright year, all rights reserved in the footer of your website. For me, it oftentimes felt like, seeing someone like my mom post on Facebook that, by posting this, I do not give Meta the right to use my image. Anyway, but we do have patterns that allow us to actually do that with that footer component. So let's go into our components here. And there in the footer, we now have this as a rendered component. And this is a really great experience for us to be able to kind of walk through what's going on with cache components. So the first thing you'll notice is that we have a suspense boundary around this component that we're actually shipping out. What that is telling us is that we basically have a bit of a server boundary here. Um, and that it's happening as something separate from the static information happening around this. So if it is not hitting a cache, it's going to show you a fallback state here if the information it's looking for isn't cached yet. But when we get into the render component that's being released, we have that use cache declaration. So that is telling us, okay, we're going to cache something here. And we can set a cache life. And so cache life is saying, okay, this is how long this thing should live for by default. We have default values out of the box, but you can define your own configurations as well. We have values like minutes, hours, days, and then max will cache for a month. So I'm saying, okay, let's declare my cache life here. Let's cache for a year or for that month. We're rendering the year. It's the new date time. I'm going to cache tag this as well with the value of date. So if I want to on my own, I can invalidate this cache, and then I'm going to return the year. So the first person who ever visits this and hits an uncached date would get a brief loading state. It'll be the briefest of loading states because it's almost instantaneous IO. But then everybody else who's going to visit it is going to get the cached version of this. You can then invalidate that cache and get the full year on New Year's Day, for instance. And you don't have to redeploy your website to get the new up-to-date date. But this is something that's very frequent, very common, exists outside of a lot of people's thinking about when it comes to rendering. It oftentimes lives in their global layout or on every page component. And it's something that could be a little bit annoying. So the one really great thing about this, I say really great, I think it's great, is when I go and I comment all those values out, I'm going to move you and refresh. I accidentally ended up in drawing mode somehow. I can't move the pen. It's right on top of the next. Oh my gosh.
This is
This
not staged, folks.
this is not staged. All right. You'll see that the next development tools tell me that I have an issue. And it's telling me that new date is used before accessing uncached data. So this error message could probably be a little bit more precise when it comes to current to time pre-rendering, but it's actually going to tell you that this would fail to build because that date is just floating out there willy-nilly. So that's kind of a really great crash course into what's going on about why we need to suspend these things. So that is kind of a small annoying example that exists outside of really the e-commerce ideas here. But let's click on a T. Let's click on a t-shirt. We went to a PDP. Now you saw that there was that flash of unstyled content there. Um, are we still doing client-side rendering? No, we're actually doing a cache component. So let's see what happens when I refresh this PDP. You see that the page is still static, but we're not getting any of that unstyled content there. So how did we go about doing that? How did we solve this problem of taking something off of the client side and moving it into a cache component? And the way we did that, I'm going to do this so it won't keep yelling at me. So we had that component where this was all happening with a use effect API call. We've actually moved it into a suspended component. So we have a suspense component, which showing our fallback, which is that rendering component that you see. But then in the render itself, we're once again using caching. And here I'm using use cache remote, which is telling me to use a persisted key value storage kind of caching and not memory caching. And I also want to cache life max this, so I want it to be able to live for a whole month. I then fetch the products from my database, and then I'm going to cache them as well. But one thing you see here that might be interesting, and if we were to take a look at this same component back here, where we didn't really have any kind of cache specificity at all, is the idea that we have cache tag and it can take in values from the data that we fetched. So we're pulling that data from our database, in this case, Sanity for this example, but I'm then iterating through all of them and then tagging the cache based on the information that was in the cache. So if I go back here, let's recreate that example. I'm going to go to the teas page here. That Grand Spark tea is $140. I go here, I reset the price. It is now $160. I go here, and the Grand Spark tea is $160. What that allowed us to do is create more intelligent caching. We got to take information that was in the data that we were putting into the cache and use that as a mechanism. So this allowed us to have more control over what was inside of our caches. And so when we do revalidation patterns, I can say update this product everywhere it lives on the website, and it will then render that way. So if this is, we don't have to know where all this product was consumed. This could be a related product, for instance, of this one. Nope, didn't go on that one. All right, it's not coming up as a related product with that particular one. But if it did, and it was in this request, that's a cache request, and we can actually update it based on tags. So we're getting still some ISR here. I refresh the page, and the whole page is statically rendered, and this dynamic component can update. We're actually going to show an example there. I'm going to reset this guy. It is now $180. I'm going to come back here. You can see that it's $180 on that component. We refresh, that information is statically rendered. We're not getting that loading screen because this component is now cached, because it's implementing a cache and it no longer has to stream that value in because it is now cached on the page. So we still get ISR here. And how are we able to do that? This goes back to that kind of earlier question where people were saying, like, if I access params or if I access search params, I still need some amount of suspense around it. The way we can do that is in our page component where I had passed an empty array before. I now need to pass a little bit of a signal to let it know what a static shell looks like. So in this case, I actually don't want to just name one particular random product. I pass in a placeholder that says, okay, I am accessing the param.handle or params.handle here, and that's a value that I want to use. It's going to pre-render that placeholder for me, which in this case would probably just pre-render my 404 for me. But it's saying, okay, with this now asynchronous value that I'm looking for, I know the pattern to look at that data with, and I can still create ISR. So we're able to statically cache these pages while taking full advantage of cache components. This is really kind of a concept for me that I had to spend a lot of time just kind of working with the code. Working with the Next team, they kind of explained this, and I was like, oh yeah, that really works. And I did a lot of webinars and I watched a lot of videos, but really this was a value that really felt great, kind of getting hands on with. And this is the, I think, a really basic example of what cache components is capable of. For instance, we have the cache component happening on the function. We could actually move that use cache declaration up into the component itself, which could be an even more efficient cache for us. We saw that you could tag the cache based on information in the cache. You can also optimize that cache by removing data that you don't need. If you had a graph request, you would be able to define every single field that you'd want. But if you're fetching from a third party that doesn't give you access to that, historically, you just cached all the data that came through. With cache components, we can purge out, some sort of large block that is unnecessary for us, but we're receiving from the source of data. And it gives us this ability to optimize. So that was kind of like the most basic example that we felt like we could get in this webinar. But we do know that there are a million more places to go with this. So we showed updating the footer, we showed updating generate static params, but taking cache components further, now that we have a basic understanding, how can we evolve our application? You can, the easiest way to do it is probably just going to be to mess around with cache components. You have a code freeze coming up. It's a great time to be able to kind of look into, how these things are working. One thing that I really love about it is showing those kind of client-side rendered components. They now kind of act a little bit like a microservice, that the data fetching is now able to be there with the rendering component. You still have the page shell acting as like the superstructure architecture, but it really lets you start getting into a little bit more architectural thinking about where data goes now that everything isn't necessarily a top level. So hopefully coming out of this, you're curious and you want to know more about what cache components can do for you. We really recommend turning on that flag, upgrading to Next 16, going through that upgrade process, and then kind of figuring out how it works. We would love if it just kind of started working for your organization and in your application. But if it didn't, we'd also love that feedback. The Next.js team has been working for years, and now that this is out in the wild, they're working like crazy to meet everybody where they're at and see how this is working in the wild because they want it to be a platform for everybody and a framework that everyone can use just about anywhere. If you are here and this sounds like something that you want to know more about for your company, we would love to talk to you as Vercel. You can learn more about how our Next.js expertise makes us the right choice for your site. And we also have a professional services team that is going to be aiding with Next 16 migrations. If that sounds like something your company might be interested in, we would love if you got in touch with us and then we could kind of connect you and see what it might look like for us to kind of literally help you do this kind of lifting while we're figuring cache components out. I wanted to leave the rest of the time that we have here for a little bit of Q&A. So, Miguel, I know that that was a whole lot, and if we don't have time to get to all these questions, we will be trying to answer as many of them as we can. We'll be kind of corresponding over the coming days, along with the recording of this talk. I am myself generally social media allergic, but I am on LinkedIn, the professional network. So if people do have questions there, I am happy to answer them if you want to just at me in whatever medium kind of exists there. But yeah, I'd love to be able to answer a few questions here. So Miguel, what do we got?
I was gonna say, all I need is one of those ice baths for my hand. So I've been answering a lot of good questions. Really, I think one of the things that I would like to hit on just around the idea of cache components is the main story that we want you guys to hear about cache components is that it's no longer focusing on the page's output, right? It's not so much about what is the page going to be doing in terms of delivery. We actually, with cache components, you get the granularity of not just the data anymore, but everything in between. You get to choose where the bar sits in terms of what gets cached or not. So for the original question that was coming out about the, like if I have a highly dynamic app, do I even need to use cache components? And there's two parts to that. So, and there was another question that came out around that too about like the suspense boundaries. Being able to leverage the suspense boundaries around the server components that are making those data fetches will give you that granularity of the page, right? The page doesn't need to wait for that piece of information to be done in order to actually send something to the user. Things will cascade down, right? And being able to have that then automatically gives you the ability to use something like cache components to say, okay, if that data is changing, if it's not changing, do I want to use cache components? Is it changing every 5 minutes? You have something that's long living, like a CMS, right? That might be blogs, and it's something that isn't changing often. But the second you go and change that blog, you fix a typo, you change a meta tag, anything like that, you want that original page to be rebuilt or that section. Maybe it's housing real-time weather data. So it's a static blog, but it has like dynamic pieces to it. You can now compartmentalize the page in a way that you want, and the framework handles how to make it efficiently deliverable. And that's kind of like the big power of where cache components are going to be going because you can handle all of that at the server level and have control over caching the data, the components themselves, as we saw today. And you can still use cache components in the way that you're doing traditional ISR and stuff right now. So if you're using ISR, I'm working with the DX team actually currently on this, being able to show like what that actually looks like using cache components. You can actually do a one-to-one swap and so that you can continue with the incremental style of adoption of these types of tools. Um, yeah, that's the only thing I think I wanted to reiterate on it. And
I think
then
it's great. Yeah, I think it's so much of it is that this enables behavior. It doesn't require behavior. It just allows you to solve the problems more in your terms because I think we see even in, in the chat, there's so many different use cases. Like so every website is a little bit different. And oftentimes we just simply did not have a tool to reach for that could even allow us to solve it on our terms. And now this is just such a powerful thing in the arsenal to be able to say, okay, what do I think is the best solution in this place?
the last thing I think that I'll wrap up with, as I see one more question, and I know we're almost at time, for things like really heavy queries, for essentially the general questions I'm seeing is like, how does it get adopted to things like the ecosystem, and how should we be approaching cache components? Is it the query, the data level, the component level, both? Um, Really, what it comes down to is again like what your app is doing. So you could have something, maybe you're a restaurant and you're caching your menu and you're displaying your menu. Um, that kind of stuff can be done at the data level. You could cache the menu itself, but then you're rendering the content every time, or you could cache the actual component itself, and you don't even need to make the computation of building that list out or whatnot. So you could have a lot of computation that happens on the server, but a really small button with one line of text that comes out of that, and you could eliminate a lot of that efficiency. It's the idea is caching is very universal. It's just a different way of approaching it in something like React Next.js.
Awesome.
I know we're at time. I know we're unfortunately can't take any more questions, but as Dan said, feel free to reach out. Find both of us on LinkedIn and reach out. We're here to connect and get in touch and keep the questions and give Next 16 a try because it's we're going some pretty cool places with cache components.
Thanks, Miguel. And thank you guys for taking time out with us. Hopefully, we found that informative. Just looking at the questions, a lot of these we will be continuing to answer as things progress. This is just the first of many webinars on the Next 16 subject. We'll have one coming up about things like personalization. We will have a lot more to say, particularly from the Vercel perspective, on what it looks like trying to use this with a CDN. Right now, like the TLDR on that is that it's kind of a challenge because it involves streaming, and you're going to have to figure out, does your CDN understand, the difference between a proper 200 and when data has streamed in? We also, it seems like we have some questions coming in about authentication as well. That's something that we get a lot at Vercel that I think we're going to be doing a lot more documentation and guides on. Um, you know, if you are doing caching or authentication in middleware, the caveat there being that it does take time to do that to make that round trip to your database. If that's something that you are currently comfortable with, you can continue to do that in proxy.ts. But there will be, more and more evolution in the ecosystem, especially as third parties, things like BetterAuth, start looking at, what cache components looks like for their libraries.
All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. And yeah, we will be sending out the recording of this and appreciate it and hope you guys have a great day. And if you are working in the ecom world, God bless for a great Thanksgiving and Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and Giving Tuesday, and all the good things.